This is California. If it were its own country, its economy would rank the 5th richest in the world, just behind Japan's but larger than the UK's. But this kind of dominance didn't happen overnight. It took until 1971 for California to overtake New York to become the largest economy in the United States. And it hasn't given up that title since. The state went from gold fields to farmland, from oil rigs to Hollywood to Silicon Valley. But how did these industries come to concentrate here in the first place? This is the story of how California became the richest state in America. During the early 1800s, California was just a sparsely populated territory under Mexican control, known mostly for its ranching, some small farms, and a few very isolated Christian missions. It received little attention until in January 1848, a man named James Marshall discovered gold at a mill near Coloma, northeast of Sacramento. Just a year later, about 90,000 people had reached California with the hopes of finding some for themselves, becoming instantly rich. By the end of 1853, that number had climbed to around 250,000. Most of whom were prospectors looking for the estimated $2 billion worth of gold that was eventually extracted during this time. The US government responded unusually. Instead of establishing California as a territory first, like it had done with nearly every other Western region, Congress admitted it directly as a state in September 1850, bypassing territorial status entirely. That allowed California to set its own expansive borders early on, encompassing mineral-rich mountains, coastal ports, and the agriculturally rich Central Valley. San Francisco's population of full-time residents went from around 1,000 people in 1848 to over 25,000 just a year later. By 1860, that number doubled to over 50,000. Its port was flooded with abandoned ships, left behind by crews that sailed them in and then headed for the gold fields. Many of those vessels were repurposed into shops, hotels, and warehouses, effectively becoming the first permanent infrastructure in what was still a frontier city, making it, at least for a while, a bit like a floating city. Within a few years of statehood, California was acting less like a post-war prize and more like a functioning branch in a national economy. By the late 1800s, California was starting to change. Gold was running out, but the soil in the Central Valley was rich, and the climate allowed crops like wheat to grow almost year-round. The only problem was water. The land was dry and the rain wasn't reliable. Without irrigation, large-scale farming wouldn't work. Despite the challenges with water, farmers began planting wheat. Lots of it. By 1890, California was producing nearly 1 million tons a year, making it one of the top wheat exporters in the world. But growing wheat year after year stripped the soil of nutrients, pushing farmers to search for more sustainable and profitable crops. That's when things started to shift. Irrigation projects slowly expanded. With more water, orchards and vineyards took over. In the South, citrus farming exploded. In places like Riverside, orange groves were producing 300 boxes per acre by the early 1900s, 3 times what they used to source. Grape farming also spread. By 1900, there were more than 200,000 acres of vineyards across the state. At the same time, demand for beef in San Francisco and Los Angeles led to a boom in cattle ranching. All of this meant they needed workers. A lot of them. In the 1870s and 1880s, about 75% of California's farm labor force was Chinese. They dug canals, cleared land, and built the systems that allowed irrigation to work. After the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, their numbers fell. Japanese immigrants began taking their place. By 1902, Japanese workers were leasing land and running farms across the state. Shortly later, Mexican labor also started rising. Then came refrigerated rail cars. In 1906, the Pacific Fruit Express launched a fleet of them. Before that, fresh produce had to be sold close to where it was grown. Now, California oranges, grapes, and lettuce could reach Chicago and New York without spoiling. California's agricultural boom had far-reaching implications. Economically, it positioned the state as a critical player in national and international food markets. Socially, it led to complex labor dynamics and demographic shifts, with waves of immigrants shaping the cultural fabric of the region. However, the reliance on irrigation raised environmental concerns, including water rights disputes and long-term sustainability of water resources, a challenge that still persists today. Hollywood came about shortly after. See, back in the 1910s, most American film production was based on the East Coast. In In fact, Thomas Edison owned the world's first film production studio in New Jersey, but through his production company, Motion Picture Patents Company, he tried to monopolize the industry by controlling key patents on cameras, projectors, and film stock. He aggressively sued independent filmmakers who didn't pay to license his technology, so they started looking for a place outside his reach. They found it in California. The Ninth Circuit Court in the West was less aggressive in enforcing patent claims, and Los Angeles was far enough from Edison's base in New Jersey that it made lawsuits harder to carry out. The weather helped too. LA had sun almost every day of the year, and open land where studios could shoot outdoors without rain delays. Terrain varied within a few hours' drive. Desert, mountain, beach, farmland, so films could simulate almost any setting. By 1915, most of the country's film production had shifted to Los Angeles. The first version of Hollywood was not glamorous. Studios operated on low budgets, using temporary sets and rotating casts. But demand grew fast. By the early 1920s, Hollywood had established itself as the world's film capital, producing virtually all films shown in the United States and accounting for 80% of the revenue from films shown abroad. In the mid-20s, 50 million people a week went to see a picture show, half the country's entire population. As the industry grew, LA began to brand itself around film. The Hollywoodland sign went up in 1923, which was originally an ad for a housing development in the hills above the city. But over time, it became a symbol of the industry itself, and the land part was eventually taken down. Studios hired publicists to promote their stars, and fan magazines helped shape a new kind of celebrity culture. The appeal wasn't just the films, it was the place. California's palm trees, Mediterranean climate, and endless light were folded into the stories. People began associating California with success, beauty, and reinvention. Speaking of inventions, that's where I'd like to introduce the sponsor of this video, Raycon, who's recently released the incredible Everyday Earbuds. This latest model is better than ever, with a 32-hour battery life, noise cancellation, and quick charge function. Just 10 minutes of charge gives you 90 minutes of battery. It's the perfect Mother's Day gift, as mothers are always on the go, juggling work, family, and everything in between. So why not add a little music to this? For me, they are the most comfortable earbuds I've tried on, thanks to its ergonomic design to comfortably fit the widest range of ears, which comes in clutch when I have them in for hours at a time, creating new videos, going on runs, or just chilling. But the best part is that Raycon earbuds start at just half the price of other premium audio brands, so it's incredibly affordable. So go to buyraycon.com/versed to get 20% off site-wide. Brought to you by Raycon. But as Hollywood was turning into Hollywood, something else was happening. In 1892, oil was discovered in Los Angeles. More fields followed. Santa Fe Springs in 1919, Huntington Beach in 1920, Long Beach in 1921. By the 1920s, Southern California was one of the top oil-producing regions in the world. In some years, Los Angeles County alone produced 25% of global output. In 1900, California produced about 4 million barrels of oil. By 1920, it produced 77 million. Oil rigs spread through neighborhoods. Wells were drilled next to schools and beaches. Cities grew around the oil. The money funded roads, buildings, and early infrastructure. But there was too much oil. Supply started outpacing demand. Prices collapsed. A barrel of oil went from $1.19 in 1900 to 65 cents by 1905. There were few rules. People drilled anywhere they could. It brought wealth, but also instability. California's growth relied on oil, but trade played a huge role as well. By the 1930s, the ports were moving massive amounts of goods in and out of California. Their size and location made them critical for wartime logistics. When the US entered World War II, California's ports became central hubs for moving troops, weapons, and supplies across the Pacific. The war economy changed everything. After Pearl Harbor, the US ramped up military production. California became a central hub. Its ports, oil, factories, and labor made it critical to the war effort. 17% of all US war production came from California. 10% of all defense spending went into the state. Los Angeles became an aircraft capital. Lockheed built bombers in Burbank. Douglas Aircraft expanded in Santa Monica and Long Beach. Inglewood and Palmdale filled with hangars and factories. San Diego built ships. The Bay Area managed Pacific naval logistics. Oakland and Richmond became wartime ports. After 1945, the Cold War kept the money flowing. California didn't scale down, it scaled up. By the 1950s, military contracts were a major part of the state economy. Aerospace was the center. In the decades following World War II, Southern California alone accounted for between 20 to 30% of all aerospace jobs in the country. By 1971, California had the largest economy of any state in the country, with a GDP of $120 billion, overtaking New York. But defense spending was concentrated. In the Korean War, 10 companies received 40% of the Pentagon's contracts. That gave California jobs, but made the economy vulnerable. If federal budgets dropped, so did local stability. This can be seen after the Cold War ended in 1991. In the 80s, Southern California still accounted for about 1/3 of all aerospace jobs in the country. But in 1993, the bottom fell out of the industry. Thousands of people lost jobs as companies moved to DC or were consolidated. Oil and war didn't just grow the state. They locked it into a pattern. Boom years when contracts came in, followed by slowdowns when they didn't. It made California powerful, but also dependent. Another important part of California's growth was based on something it didn't have much of. As I said earlier, California needed water. By the 1930s, Los Angeles and the Central Valley were running dry. Farming was booming. Cities were growing, but water wasn't keeping up. So the solution was to move it. The Central Valley Project started in the 1930s. It was one of the biggest water systems ever built. Dams, reservoirs, canals, more than 500 miles of waterways. It redirected rivers to California's dry farmland. Today, it supplies water to over 3 million acres of farmland and 2.5 million people across the state. Los Angeles did something similar. The LA Aqueduct was finished in 1913. It brought water from the Owens River more than 200 miles away. It was a gravity-fed system. No pumps, just gravity pulling the water south. That's how Los Angeles kept growing. But it came at a cost. The project drained the Owens Valley, sparking water wars and lawsuits that still persist to this day. Then there was the California Aqueduct. It was part of the State Water Project, built in the 1960s. It moved water from Northern California to the dry South. It was over 700 miles long and cost billions. The idea was simple: send Northern California's rain and snowmelt to where the people lived. Without these projects, California's growth would have hit a wall, given 27 million people of the state's 40 million people rely on it. At the same time, California was building highways. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 paid for thousands of miles of freeways. It was meant to connect cities and towns. But in California, it made something new. It made suburbia. Los Angeles was the car capital of the country at the time. Sprawled outwards, houses with lawns and driveways replaced dense urban blocks. By 1960, it was a blueprint for car-based cities, and it had more miles of freeway than any other metropolitan area in the world. All of this allowed California to support growing faster than anywhere else. Its population boomed. From 1940 to 1960, the state grew from 7 million to over 15 million people. It was the water and the highways that made it possible. But building everything around cars and irrigation would come with problems down the line. In the mid-20th century, California went through a transformation of another kind. At the heart of it was Stanford University. For the first half of the 1900s, Stanford wasn't really a top-rated university like it is now. But that all changed when a man named Frederick Terman became Stanford's Dean of Engineering in 1944. During the war, Terman directed a staff of more than 850 at the Radio Research Laboratory at Harvard University, where he oversaw top-secret radar jamming and electronics R&D for the US military. After the war, he brought the defense research model back to Stanford, helping secure military contracts in electronics, communications, and microwave technologies. He pushed the university to focus on more practical, applied research, particularly in engineering and physics. This was a major shift away from Stanford's previous liberal arts and pure science focus. As Stanford's Dean of Engineering, Terman wanted graduates to stay in California instead of leaving for the East Coast. So to stop this brain drain, he encouraged students to start companies locally and offered support. Two of his most famous protégés were Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard, who started Hewlett-Packard in a garage in Palo Alto, the original Silicon Valley garage startup. Seeing their success, Terman became even more convinced that Stanford should actively support high-tech industry close to campus. Thus, he proposed a Stanford-affiliated and R&D-focused business park that would generate income for Stanford as well as tax revenue for the Palo Alto community. Stanford University and the city of Palo Alto partnered to found the park, which was initially named Stanford Industrial Park when it was established in 1951, now known as the Stanford Research Park. It leased cheap land to tech companies. Hewlett-Packard moved in first. Varian Associates followed. Soon, dozens of companies were there, all built around Stanford's research, and it was all right next to the university. By the 1960s, Stanford had turned Palo Alto into a tech hub, and the timing couldn't have been better. During the Cold War, the US government was pouring money into technology. The Department of Defense spent billions on research for things like radar, computing, and semiconductors. Much of that money went to California. It was Stanford's connections to the military that really made things take off. Between the 1950s and 1970s, Stanford received so much federal research funding from the Department of Defense that it's been said they built Silicon Valley. This is only half the story of its creation though. The other man integral to the creation of Silicon Valley, who quite literally is the reason for the Silicon part of its name, was William Shockley. In 1956, Shockley started Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory in Mountain View, California, which was close to his elderly mother in Palo Alto, California. The company was the first establishment working on silicon semiconductor devices in the state. But Shockley was a terrible boss, and in late 1957, his 8 leading scientists known as the Traitorous 8 resigned, and became the core of what would later become Fairchild Semiconductor. It made the first commercially successful integrated circuit and was the first company to commercially produce silicon transistors. But it also became an incubator for new companies. Over the course of the next 20 years, more than 65 new enterprises would end up having employee connections back to Fairchild. Intel was one of them. So was AMD. The last piece of this puzzle was venture capital. Before the 1970s, investments were pretty hard to get. Most banks avoided risky startups, but venture capitalists didn't. And they all set up shop on Sand Hill Road, right next to Stanford. They pumped money into new companies, often founded by Stanford students and professors. Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia Capital were the biggest names. They invested in companies like Apple, Cisco, and Oracle. The money allowed small companies like these at the time to scale fast. Apple was the breakthrough. Founded in 1976 by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, it went public in 1980. The IPO created instant millionaires, and it inspired a wave of new startups. By the 1980s, the region was being called Silicon Valley. It wasn't just about semiconductors anymore. It was computers, software, networking, everything. Stanford kept feeding the cycle. Its professors consulted for private companies. Its graduates started their own. And the university's relationship with the military didn't stop. By the 1990s, Silicon Valley was home to the most valuable tech companies in the world, and it made California the center of the tech world. The last piece of California's insane wealth comes from its location. And no, I'm not talking about the fact that it has beaches, snow, mountains, and just overall incredible weather and geography that makes it universally appealing in that sense, but rather its ports. While World War II initially caused California's ports to expand rapidly, the New York and New Jersey port on the East Coast was still the busiest overall. Things started to change though in the 60s, with the rise of container shipping making deep water ports like Los Angeles and Long Beach far more efficient. West Coast ports like LA had more land to develop large-scale container terminals, rail yards, and freeway access, while East Coast ports had to deal with tight urban density and retrofitting older infrastructure. This isn't just what I mean by location though, because if we zoom out a bit, the West Coast is much closer to major Asian exporters like China, Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam. China's entry into the global economy after market reforms in the late 1970s made the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach instantly more important. The Port of Los Angeles is the busiest container port in all of the US, while the Port of Long Beach usually comes second. And together, they handle around 40% of all US container imports, making them critical to the national economy and global trade. Today, California really has everything. It's by far richer than any other US state. But as much as it's excelling, it's also starting to falter. It has the highest poverty rate in the US at 18.9% according to the supplemental poverty measure from the government, which is a lot more accurate than the official poverty measure, as it considers after-tax income, factors in local costs like housing, and includes benefits such as food stamps and tax credits, compared to just pre-tax income that the standard poverty rate measures. The housing crisis is out of control. The cost of living is out of control. People are getting pushed out. Homelessness is everywhere, yet keeps getting worse. Infrastructure isn't being maintained. And this is happening next to trillion-dollar companies like Apple, Google, and Meta. Some major companies are leaving. Tesla, Oracle, and Hewlett-Packard have all moved their headquarters out of California. They say it's because of high costs, regulations, and housing problems. California's growth made it rich, but now that same growth is making it fragile. It built itself on migration, speculation, and constant expansion. Now, those things are working against it. The big question now is whether California can fix itself, or has the growth model that made it rich finally broken? Thank you for watching, and again, thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to click the link in my description below to get the Everyday Earbuds 20% off site-wide. See you in the next one.